Good afternoon and or good morning if you are joining us on the West Coast, or good evening if you're joining us from Europe or Israel or anywhere across the Atlantic. I'm Magda Tedder. I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today for our webinar with James McAuley about his award-winning book, The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collections and the Fall of France. We apologize for the sudden change of plans, time and venue, but we are living in unpredictable times, and our speaker was unable to arrive in New York from Paris. The 6-hour difference made it impossible for us to hold the 6 p.m. slot. I am grateful to all of you who have joined us today, and I apologize to those of you who could not join us, and I hope you will watch the webinar later on. I purchased James McAuley's book, The House of Fragile Things, as soon as it was released in May 2021. Those of you who received our newsletter will know that I recommended the book as a winter break reading. James McAuley masterfully explores the role of art and material culture played in the expression of identity of French Jews who, believing in the French Republican Universalist ideal, saw their Frenchness and Jewishness as symbiotic, and the way material culture manifested itself in the rejection of Jews by French anti-Semites. The book is beautifully written, weaving personal stories, art, literature in a masterful narrative. I'm happy to say that my students are reading the book this semester. The House of Fragile Things won the 2021 National Jewish Book Award in the category of history from the Jewish Book Council. James McAuley received the Marshall Fellowship, which sent him to Oxford University, where he completed his doctorate in history, and the book is a product of that process. James is currently the Paris correspondent for the Washington Post and a contributor to the New York Review of Books. Before I turn the screen over to James, I want to express my gratitude to those who make these events possible. I'm grateful to the Knapp Family Foundation, the Pickett Family Foundation, Eugene Schwidler for their support, and to so many of you in the audience for both your generosity in supporting these events and for your interest in joining us on so many of them. Let me now turn over the screen to James. James, the screen is yours.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Fordham University, the Center for Jewish Studies, and especially to Magda for having me here with you all today. It is an absolute pleasure. And I really appreciate your kindness and your interest in the book. And it means a great deal. So I thought I would begin briefly before I have a little presentation to show you with some images that illustrate one of the central stories in the book, with just a little bit of an overview of the project and some of the central arguments in it and how I came to be interested in the topic. So it all began many years ago when I was about 10 years old, when, I should say that despite my super Anglo-sounding name, I am Jewish myself. And that means when traveling, I was brought to a lot of Jewish sites all over the place. And in Paris, one of those was the Musée Camondo, which I went to for the first time. I don't remember exactly. I would have been around 10 or 11. And, for those of you who haven't been, although I'm sure many of you have, it's this kind of jewel box museum on the side of this very beautiful park near the Arc de Triomphe called the Parc Monceau. And it is the exquisite collection of this very famous collector named Moïse de Camondo, who collected 18th century art and objets d'art sort of to perfection. And, I didn't know much about the art at the time, but I was blown away by the traces of the family that had lived in this house. And at the time, there was not much on them. So when you come into the Musée Camondo, there's a plaque that commemorates the opening of the museum, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in the 1930s. And then underneath, there's a small secondary plaque that was added in the 1960s, sort of as an afterthought. And it reveals that the daughter of the founder, Béatrice de Camondo, who is sort of my main character, so to in a sense, and her children were all deported and murdered to Auschwitz, along with her ex-husband Leon Reinach, where they were all murdered. And I was just absolutely taken aback by that, and by the eerie juxtaposition of the beauty of the house and all that it contains with the complete brutality of what happened to the people who once lived in it and who indeed gave it to France as a token of their appreciation for all that, as they saw, the country had given them. And I sort of had that in the back of my mind. And when I was doing my PhD and it came time to come up with a dissertation topic, I was working on France, and I was working on Jewish history in France, between Dreyfus and Vichy, a very well-trodden territory, of course. And it occurred to me that in this nevertheless very vast literature, there had been very little on the role of art and material culture in the experience of French Jews in this very fraught moment, when the ideals of the Republic were tested as they had never been before, and indeed when they crumbled into smithereens. And the reason that was one thought. And then it occurred to me, as I sort of dug around a little bit more, that the Camondo was not an isolated story. And in fact, I mentioned Leon Reinach. There were other Jewish families in this sort of Jewish elite at the time in France who were all intermarried. And to borrow from Chaim Berman's famous phrase that sort of composed this cousinhood, where it was really one big family. And so many of these families left a similar exquisite collection to France in the 1920s and 30s as a token of appreciation. And I was just fascinated by that, and it seemed to me an important part of the story. And I've always been interested in collecting as a concept, and in the book, I try to show that it can seem quite a niche topic, but actually, I would argue and attempt to do in the book that collecting is both a psychological and social enterprise. So it reveals quite a lot psychologically about the collector, him or herself, and I try to show some of the human particularities and contradictions about some of the characters in this milieu, this Jewish milieu, in a fraught moment. But also it's social in the sense that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and collectors collect certain things that have a political or cultural or some kind of valence that has a message to impart to the broader public. And that I think is really important in the sense that each of these, and again, the book is basically 5 families, each of whom left a major bequest to the public. So the social element is really important because each of these collections was ultimately gifted and open to the public with a certain narrative ascribed to it about, and I should say this is another important part, the glories of the French aesthetic genius. Now, the period that I'm writing about, the Third Republic, was a golden age in the sale and creation of modern art. And that is not the story I tell in the book. And that is another story in which Jews were very influential and crucial. And that has been told elsewhere very well. There's a new book by Charles Delheim at Brandeis on that, and I would highly recommend that. But I was interested in these families that collected specifically French, like 18th century, like Moïse de Camondo, 18th century objets d'art, because this was considered at that time the high watermark of French cultural genius. And so the Jewish collector was meant, in many cases, was conveying a certain message of gratitude to the nation that had been in some ways more generous to to its Jews than many of its other European counterparts. France was the first nation in Western Europe that emancipated its Jewish population during the Revolution, although, of course, there was a constant stream of anti-Semitism throughout the 19th century. But in the minds of many of these families, I mean, France was a place that not only had saved them, but that had offered them an unprecedented amount of social achievement and professional success and so on and so forth. So these collections were all gifts, and what they were showing in some cases was how they were more French than the French, essentially. And we'll talk about that as soon as I get to the PowerPoint. But so I have that element in it. And then I really wanted to show something else that I was just really captivated by in my research, which was the degree to which so much of the anti-Semitic rhetoric at the time was material in nature. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the actual text of the most infamous anti-Semites of the period, such as Edouard Drumont, whose best-selling screed against Jews, La France Juive, published in 1886, which, by the way, made the fortunes of the publishing house Flammarion, which still exists today. It is striking how Drumont is obsessed. Drumont, by the way, was an antiquarian by training. He's very attuned to art and objects, but is obsessed with the question of Jews and materiality. So Jews are foreign because they buy objects that are foreign to them, such as the French items that you'll see some images of in a minute. They are invaders because they purchase homes that belong to the French national narrative and not to the Jewish people, and so on and so forth. But it is the sort of the primacy of the material in his critique. And I thought that was a really important thing to try and bring into the conversation, because it makes a lot of sense why art and material culture in general was so important, not only in the lived experiences of French Jews in the period I'm writing in, but also the way that they responded to this virulence all throughout and up until the very end. And so that is the project of the book. And ultimately, what I hope it achieves most of all is to bring to life a little bit some of these amazing women and men that essentially vanished from the records. I mean, it's ironic because, of course, they left so much behind. I mean, this is not quite traditional microhistory in the sense of the cheese and the worms or anything like that. This is not Natalie Zemon Davis. This is not Carlo Ginzburg. But these were. It's impossible to have been more elite, and yet, despite the objects that have survived them, the people themselves have not, and nothing really remains of them. And I tried to the best of my ability to give a sense of who and what they were, because in the end, that is all that matters. With that sort of intro in mind, I will now sort of tell one of the main principal stories in the book, and then afterwards, Magda and I will discuss, and we'll have some questions. So let me just get the PowerPoint up and running, and then go from there. There we go. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So this is one of the most important items, sort of paintings in the not sort of painting. It is a painting. One of the most important works of art that I follow throughout the book. This is Renoir's 1880 portrait of Irène Cahen d'Anvers. And Irène herself is a character in the book. So, and again, as I was saying, this is a really interwoven world, and I apologize in advance for the fact that basically everybody in the story is named Irène, Leon, or Beatrice, but bear with me, I'll try and do my best to keep it all together. So, Irène Cahen d'Anvers is the scion of, or I should say, the eldest daughter of one of the most prominent banking families in the Third Republic, the Cahen d'Anvers. one of the founders of the bank that through various permutations is today the Bank Paribas. And they were fabulously wealthy. They were saloniers in Paris, contemporaries of the great artists and writers of the time, and the pinnacle of that sort of Proustian Parisian world. And I should mention that Proust was a guest in the home of the Quai d'Anvers. There are letters between Proust and Madame Quai d'Anvers. Those are all in the book by Philip Kolb of Proust's letters, if anybody's interested. Also, just as a brief aside, this book has Proust as sort of a leitmotif in it because Proust's own protagonist in À la Recherche, the great novel of modernism, is of course Charles Swann, who is a Jewish collector. And there's something to that, as the Jewish collector as the sort of red thread through which to understand the Third Republic and its social world that I try to follow. And indeed, so many of the protagonists in my book are some of the inspirations that Proust drew on to draw his picture. So I try to follow some of his social connections as a means of tracing like who to pay attention to in my own work. So anyway, the Quai d'Anvers are this fabulously wealthy, very socially connected family, and this is the world into which Irene Quai d'Anvers, who you see here, is born into. And this is the real life Irene. And I found this in the National Archives in Paris, and I love this photo of her because it's in the same angle of profile, and you get a sense of the real young person as opposed to the sort of stylized ideal. And again, the painting was not so much admired by Mr. and Mrs. Quai d'Anvers, who thought it was sort of vulgar. And Renoir, by the way, was deeply anti-Semitic and complained about them specifically constantly. But the painting was exhibited in the Salon that year, was very well received. And this is an etching of it that comes from the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, the sort of central magazine of this whole Parisian artistic world, edited by, of course, Charles F. Roussy, who is another great Jewish collector and who is the subject of Edmund de Val's Hair with Amber Eyes, which I'm sure many of you have read. It's a beautiful book, and I highly recommend it, if not. Irene has this sort of public life, but then a very complicated inner life, as did many of the women in this milieu, who were essentially expected to be the decorative objects that their portraits literally were in so many houses. They were expected to be dutiful daughters and wives. They were excluded in many cases from Jewish communal life. And they were really meant to be like Irene's mother, Louise Quai d'Anvers, a great hostess, and that was sort of it. And Irene herself seems to have rebelled against this from the very beginning. These are portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Quai d'Anvers by Bonnat, and for Mr. Quai d'Anvers, and by Carolus Durand for Mrs. Quai d'Anvers. These today are exhibited in the Château de Champs-sur-Marne, which is this right outside Paris, which was their house that they bought. And it's a good illustration of the point that I tried to make in my introduction about 18th century as the high watermark for this milieu. So the house Champs-sur-Marne, just as a brief aside, it has this illustrious history. So it belonged at one point to Madame de Pompadour. It played host to the likes of Voltaire and Chateaubriand. It's really a piece of French history, and was seen so at the time. And instead of building their own house or new construction or whatever, the Quai d'Anvers bought this old property and restored it to its former glory, including, with the touches that you see in the room here. And there are some, things that are not quite 18th century, such as some of the chairs, but the rest of it is a very faithful interpretation to that aesthetic. And I argue that what they were doing exists on many levels, but one of those levels is writing Jews into France's roman national, the common phrase you hear here in Paris, which is the national novel, the national story. So a house like this belongs in the national story because it's Madame de Pompadour, it's Voltaire, it's Chateaubriand, it's all these great figures. And now in the 1920s, it is a Jewish family. So who has as much of a right to be in that story as any of the previous figures. And it's a very powerful message, I think, that clearly infuriated the likes of Drummond. So anyway, Irene is born into this world. It is a very difficult world to live in, and she's kind of meant to be this ideal of perfect femininity that she struggles with, and I'll return to that in a minute. So this here is Edouard Drummond, who I mentioned in my introductory remarks. He was, in France, he's called the Pope of anti-Semitism. Because he was this sort of unbelievably unparalleled, virulent anti-Semite. And as I mentioned, the materiality of so many of these Jewish families, and by materiality, I mean the houses that they had, the stunning collections they amassed, this really, for Drummond, was difficult to accept. It was a kind of violence in his eyes. And this young man is the young Moïse de Camondo, to whom Irene was betrothed. And it was this sort of arranged marriage. Moïse de Camondo at the time was 31, and Irene was 19. And it was a very difficult relationship, I think, for her especially. I mean, no one really seems to have ever asked her what she wanted out of her life, but it was certainly not this. I mean, Moïse de Camondo was a business associate of her father's, so there was that sort of financial element to it, especially because the Camondo, known as the Rothschilds of the East, were this fabulously wealthy Sephardic banking dynasty from Constantinople who had arrived in Paris in the 1860s. And who, in some ways, in terms of financial interests, were similar to the Quai d'Anvers, but very different otherwise. I mean, for one, the Quai d'Anvers were not that observant. The Camondo were very observant. The Quai d'Anvers were very Parisian, and at this point, the Camondo were not yet French citizens and were not that enmeshed in the cultural life of the capital, and so it wasn't a perfect match really in any way. And I think Moïse de Camondo was quite authoritarian from all the traces that we have of his character. And so for a young woman, this was not a comfortable situation, and she sort of rebelled against that from the very beginning. And Irene, this is a picture of Irene Quai d'Anvers with her two Camondo children, the big children. And then she actually left Moïse de Camondo for a man who worked in her husband's stables, who was Catholic, and it caused a huge uproar because she left both her family and her faith. She converted to Catholicism and just left the whole world behind. And then had a new child, this young, the toddler in the photo, whose name was Claude or Poussy. And the older children are Béatrice de Camondo, the older daughter, and Nissim de Camondo. And again, I apologize for all these names and characters, but it's a very interwoven story, and it's sort of impossible to tell otherwise. But essentially, you have this very headstrong, very complicated woman who sets out to create a life of her own against all costs, even if it means leaving her own family and her own older children behind, which she does. The older Camondo children, and indeed the whole Camondo family, are essentially a microcosm of the story of the Jews in France. Nissim de Camondo, her older son, is in the French army in World War I and dies fighting for France. It's a sort of heartbreaking story that shatters his father. It's the moment when Moïse becomes the obsessive collector and really kind of gets rid of his business interests and really only goes after art and objet d'art for the rest of his life. And there's a sense that there was this amazing thing that I found in my research where he was obsessed with retrieving his son's remains from behind enemy lines. And he actually does get them back so that he can have a proper Jewish burial. But what you start to notice after the funeral is that he attacks some of his acquisitions for whatever it is, vases, credenzas, etc., with the same sort of hyper focus and intensity. And you really get the sense that collecting for him was a means of creating some kind of control in a world that was increasingly chaotic. Irene, this is Irene Candenver. Sorry for jumping around. This is Irene Candenver later in life with one of her new boyfriends after she divorced her second husband. So she has this sort of truly interesting and unique life for a woman in that moment in the 1920s, 1930s. Okay, to cut forward just a little bit. Irene's daughter, Beatrice de Camondo, who was a passionate equestrienne, right there on the horse that you see. This is a picture of her from the Camondo archive, along with another picture of her husband, Leon Reinach. Now, the Reinachs were essentially like the James family in the US in the 19th century, the sort of center, or one of the centers of cultural life in the Third Republic. They were politicians, they were collectors, they were writers, journalists, artists, polymaths, absolutely. And today they have essentially vanished from public consciousness. And one of the great tragedies I encountered in writing the book is that in the town of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which was sort of the family seat, it's about an hour outside of Paris, the Reinach house used to have a plaque that was there when I began my PhD research, and then it was taken down as part of some renovation by the municipality, and it has not yet been put back up. So we can only hope that one day it will. Anyway, Leon and Beatrice are married. Things are not super comfortable between them either. It's another of these arranged marriages between two families in the same sort of Jewish elite that didn't really take into account the personalities of the two people involved. Beatrice is sort of a socialite and passionate equestrian, and Leon is an intellectual who wants to be a composer, and it doesn't really gel between them. And eventually they divorce during the war, which is quite a bureaucratic labor to attempt at that time. So 1940 comes around, and the Nazis arrive in Paris in a sort of astonishing couple of days, faster than anyone thought that they would. And the question becomes, what to do with or how to protect the art and private collections. And in many cases, in most cases, it was too late. And in France's national museums. And this is a photo of part of the ERR. My German is not very good, so I'm not going to pronounce the whole thing, but the art task force of the Nazi regime, headed by Alfred Rosenberg, in the Louvre Museum. And indeed, the Louvre was looted along with many other places. However, before the Nazis arrived, this is a man, by the way, Jacques Jaujard, who deserves a lot of credit for safeguarding a lot of the French national treasures from the museums. However, he deserves extra credit because he also welcomed for safekeeping many Jewish collections, which he brought along with Louvre treasures, to the Chateau Chambord in the Loire Valley, which I'm sure many of you have visited. And it is there that the portrait of Irene Candenver, which was a wedding present given to Leon and Beatrice by their grandmother, was kept during the war. So the portrait that I showed you at the beginning of Irene in profile did not actually belong to Irene herself, but ended up in her daughter's home in Neuilly, outside Paris, and was brought to this chateau where it was for at least a little while. And we don't know exactly when it left, but it was there for about a year. Wait a second, sorry. Let me just stay here for a second before I go on. So what happens to the family after that is incredibly brutal, shocking, and fast. This is Elizabeth Candenver, Irene's sister and Beatrice's aunt. This is a photo of her from a private family archive taken of her in hiding in 1943. And She was an old woman, rather infirm, struggled to walk, and was hunted down by the local Gestapo authorities and eventually deported, sent to Drancy, and then to Auschwitz, where she was killed. The same happens to Beatrice, to Leon, and to their two children, Fanny and Bertrand Reinach. So this entire world is essentially destroyed. One thing that I was really moved by in the research was, you spend so many years of your life tracing these people's footsteps and reading everything you can find about them, and then, nothing really prepares you for the moment when, should you be so lucky, you get to hear your subjects speak for themselves. And this was the only time I ever got to hear the voice of Beatrice de Camondo, or rather read it. And it's a letter that she wrote to one of her close childhood friends 3 months to the day before her arrest by the Nazis in December 1942. And in it, she describes in truly earnest and kind of zealous terms her conversion to Catholicism. Now, as a Jew myself, I thought before that, of course she converted, as did many others, as a doomed insurance policy, and didn't think much of it. But in the letter, it really changed everything that I thought that I knew, which is kind of the way it goes. You lose sight of how complicated and inscrutable people are in real life, and she is no exception. And she really believed up until the end, and this. Here it is, that that God and the Virgin will protect me, and of course they didn't. Needless to say. And it's really amazing. And when I found this, it just sort of changed everything in terms of how I thought through the book. This is my favorite photo of Beatrice de Camondo because of everything I was just saying. It's, number one, it's another profile shot that sort of connects with the portrait of her mother, but also that her face is obscured in the sense that, there's so much about her that we still do not know. And, the letter is just one data point, but, who else? And it's like that with every subject. I mean, there's just so much that we will never, ever be able to understand. So just to return to the story of the painting, and then I'll wrap up. It was stolen by the Nazis from Chambord. It passes into the hands of Hermann Goering at some point, which is really amazing to think about. And it eventually ends up surviving the war and being returned to France in 1946 from the Munich depot. Where it was presided over by Rose Valland, another hero, unsung hero of this story. And the painting, it has so this is the real life Irène Cahen d'Anvers in the 1950s, before her death in 1963. She survives the war, and she gets the painting back, even though it was not her legal property. It belonged to her parents first, and then they gave it to their granddaughter, Beatrice de Camondo. But then, Beatrice's heirs all were killed, obviously, and Irène survived and was the namesake of the portrait, so she was able to get it back. And then what did she do with this portrait, this priceless family heirloom and souvenir? She sold it to this man, who is Emile Bourla, who was a Nazi collaborator and who had bought many sort of looted Jewish items on the black market in Paris during the war, and who was ultimately forced to give a lot of that back after the fact. And he bought, and some of those, by the way, are in the Paul Rosenberg collection. He took a lot of Rosenberg stuff and had to get it back after the war. But with this case, it's really complicated because you have, this is Bourla, who was a Nazi collaborator because he was an arms dealer and dealt a lot with the Germans and the Italians. And you have a painting that is the stolen property of a Holocaust victim, which is the legal property of a Nazi collaborator because of the subject of the portrait itself, which is really hard to accept, even if, of course, Iran was not the first survivor or family member of survivors to sort of get rid of traces of their loved ones who had perished. But you sort of have to ask yourself, why did it have to be him? And today, the painting sits in Zurich in the collection, the Burla collection, where there can't be any restitution claim made on it because it was sold fair and square to Burla by the actual woman depicted in the painting. And the painting had this amazing afterlife. Here it is in the Godard film Breathless from 1960, while Iran was still alive. But, you know, it's an image that's on coffee mugs and tote bags around the world. And, you know, it has this amazing Jewish past and sort of dark story behind it, but that is more or less entirely unknown. We, you know, in this scene of the film, you know, Jean Seberg asks her lover, who is prettier, me or the girl in the painting? And that's all the figure in the painting is for most people, just a girl, without this context. And, you know, one of the things I've tried to do is to bring that context back. And just to finish, this is a photo of the Camondo tomb in the Cimetière de Montmartre in Paris. And it's fallen into complete disrepair. You know, the windows are broken, there are cobwebs everywhere. And it's sort of a metaphor of what's happened to this entire world. It's sort of vanished from view, despite that so many of these collections remain, and that we've lost so much, and we don't even seem to be aware of how much we've lost. And so with that, I will. I could continue talking all day, but with that, I will stop, and we can have a little discussion.
Thank you so much, James. And I could talk with you also all evening, all day, because the book is so rich, so amazing. And I will ask a couple of questions to get us started. There are some really good ones in the Q&A, and I'll tie to some of them. But you know, there are many books about anti-Semitism, as you said, about French anti-Semitism, about this period. And I think what your book is different in the way that it doesn't focus on the anti-Semitic propaganda and anti-Semitic texts, but it focuses on the lived time and space and also the materiality of life and embodied life of these Jews who are your story. And yet it also speaks of these larger questions of national heritage, identity, inclusion, exclusion, belonging. It's a really incredibly powerful work. The way I see your book complicates the story and understanding of anti-Semitism, and I think some our audience today can see how complicated these stories are, is what you alluded to the Durmond's obsession with the materiality of it, right? And you coined the term material anti-Semitism, which I think is very good. But to me, that phrase material anti-Semitism also flipped it a little bit in the other direction. That is, Drummond is obsessed with materiality. Right? He is obsessed with these possessions. He is not just projecting that Jews as carnal and these, material, grubbers of heritage, but he himself is obsessed with the materiality of life, so that to me has an interesting, and of course he uses that to challenge this, what is the soul of the nation. But so while these, this combines the old anti-Semitic tropes with the new ones, what I wanted to ask you to sort of elaborate on is what you say at one point in your book, when you say that some of the French anti-Semites believed that Jews were fundamentally counterfeit, doomed to mimetic parroting of a national identity and could never be theirs. They were, quote, facsimiles of Frenchmen. And as a result, they had no right to even collect Christian art. So I wonder whether you could sort of reflect more on the larger question of ownership, claims to heritage, national heritage, and even at that last example that you gave, the claims to the painting, that also complicates that story.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of your kind words, and I think that's an excellent question. It's a very complicated one. I would start by saying, one thing I that you bring up that I didn't mention in the presentation, which is that you're absolutely right. In the fin de siècle and early 20th century, and even before the fin de siècle, this was a material universe that affected Jews and non-Jews alike. I mean, it was just the sort of the tenor of the age in which they were all inscribed. So you had, for the first time, this new market of the sale of art and objets d'art that had exclusively been the province of the nobility for centuries, all of a sudden for sale for public consumption by a new financial elite that was self-made, and Jewish, but also non-Jewish. So there are other great, collections of the same period that still exist that were made by non-Jewish collectors. And, it was a way for both groups, I think, to purchase a kind of prestige and to purchase a kind of provenance, most importantly. And I write about this in the book, but the items that were the most desirable for people for all of these collectors were items with royal provenance, and specifically this sort of the siren song of Marie Antoinette. And indeed, one of Drumont's most memorable lines in La France Juive is how he says that the heart breaks to see the harpsichord of Marie Antoinette in the Rothschild chateau of Ferrières. So I think the materiality of the age bred a certain insecurity for Jewish collectors who were engaged in presenting a certain image, but also for non-Jewish collectors who, in many cases, were themselves not elite in any stretch of the imagination, but who also, for the first time, had means of disposable income and who tried to use it to build these kind of Count of Monte Cristo style public identities. And so the fact that Jews would do the same thing, I think, was triggering to many of them, because this claim to prestige, no matter who you were, was sort of always a fiction and was always fragile. And I think the fact that these Jewish collectors, not all of whom were foreigners at the beginning, some of them were French for centuries, but some of them were, like the Camondo were immigrants, would do the same, was deeply affronting, because they themselves were not comfortable in their own sort of material identities in this material world.
Right, and as your characters are using it to express the symbiosis of their Frenchness and Jewishness and their belonging to France, that act of collecting is taken as as you said, as an affront, and in fact as evidence of exclusion and rejection from that national belonging.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because I did all the research for this mostly in France. I mean, the Rothschild archive is in London, but most of the stuff is here. And the question that I always got from archivists and even from sort of French experts that I consulted with is, why are you singling out the Jewish collectors? How can you say that their story is distinct from any of the others? And on some level, it's a valid question, right? The taste was not different. There is no such thing as a Jewish taste in this context. They didn't buy different items than their non-Jewish counterparts did. Certainly not. And there were other non-Jewish collectors that left bequests in the same time. But to me, it's just sort of a kind of flabbergasting question to be asked, because it's like, well, the reason that we can pay attention to the distinct experiences of these particular people is that the story ended vastly different for them because they were all essentially, or not, some of them died before the war, but because all of their descendants were denationalized, deported, and in some cases murdered, and the collections were spoliated in according fashion. And so it's like, well, whether we wish to see it or not, there was this decidedly, Jewish experience that governed the lives of the collectors, whether or not the collections themselves are Jewish, so to speak. And I really am always struck by that. I mean, it comes from this sort of French resistance to, communal identity and sort of, reading history that way. But I mean, I don't know how you look at the 1940s and see it any other way.
And I think that ties really nicely to the question that I was going to ask you next, that it seems to be even that question from the various archivists that you've encountered is signaling that post-war erasure. So you end the book with the erasure. So I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit more about this erasure and denial of the role Jews played in that construction of French heritage, and also what that erasure meant and its function after the war.
Yeah. That's such a complicated question because, of course, on the one hand, compared with where we were in, say, 1985, there's been so much done in France to commemorate what happened in the war, the crimes of the French state against Jewish citizens, and the Holocaust in general. There was a formal apology by Jacques Chirac. There's a world-class museum in Paris, the Mémorial de la Shoah. There's so much, right? It's a major focal point in French history, which now more or less, if you work on French history at the graduate level, it's either Vichy or Algeria. I mean, it's not a kind of forgotten topic, but it's still so true that so much of the story is sort of unknown, and I think and erased, as you say, because for so long. There was this sort of complete refusal to grapple with the complicity of the Republic, or what was left of it, in the persecution of Jewish citizens, that the lived experiences of the actual victims and survivors was the last thing on anybody's mind, and it still is, even as we talk about, you mentioned earlier, like, there are lots of things about anti-Semitism or about, the mechanics of the destruction, but the actual people, they've never been the center of the discussion, and even now, they really are not. And there's this tendency, there's this sort of new turn in the scholarship in France toward a kind of, no, it's no longer denial at all, but it's a kind of defensiveness. And now there's this argument that's been circulating for a while about, well, what happened was awful, but fewer Jews were murdered in France than were killed in other countries, and so that means something. Which, okay, I take the point, but I'm not sure that this is a numbers game, and I think it's sort of perverse that we make it one. And the other point is that, survival is also rupture, and it means something that, from the milieu that I wrote about, many were murdered, but some descendants and family members survived, and all of them, every single one, has left France, and they do not live here anymore. And why is that? And that's the story, in a sense, that this world that once was this edifice, this sort of French experience of the so-called Israelite, the sort of proud French Jew of the 19th century. And, I think like Maurice Samuels at Yale has written so well on that. That whole world is gone, and it will never exist here again. And that is the part that I feel like we have not really begun to grapple with so much here in France, and what I hoped in some small way the book would try and do.
Yeah, and it seems like the pivotal moment was the Dreyfus affair, in which those ruptures began and those rifts began to be at least visible. I mean, they had been there, but they became visible. So I'll finish my question with a broader question for you. How does that historical perspective and that story that you've written about inform your work? Or as a Paris correspondent for the Washington Post?
Well, I think it's interesting to think about that. I mean, so first of all, I'm no longer the Paris correspondent. I now do a column for the Post, but I'm still
Okay.
here for them. But sort of same story, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, I think you know, I guess because of my own background and interests, I'm particularly attuned to the question of anti-Semitism in France and in Europe, and so on and so forth, and just issues of Holocaust denial and distortion, which is huge all over Europe, especially here. But outside of that kind of particular subject area, which is the same subject area as the book, I think in France the issue, the eternal question, is always about the place of particular minority communities in the so-called universalist republic. And so, France is a place in which the state does not recognize, it's illegal even to collect data about race, ethnicity, or religion. And that comes from, of course, the legacy of the war, which I write about in the book. But really, what it does is create this strain in the contemporary, multicultural, cosmopolitan, interconnected world that we live in. It creates this strange squeamishness about the role of particular identity affiliations in the life of the individual. And so there's a kind of effacement there as well. And I think, the debate over, I mean, it's complicated, of course, but the debate over things like the headscarf and about Islam in public life, which is hugely sensitive in France, especially after all of these awful terror attacks in recent years, is really fascinating on these grounds, because I feel like the characters in my book were trying to carve out a place for a particular minority experience in public life, and were successful at it in some ways. But they many of them were proud Jews always, who were able to be in the sort of Republican institutions, and it seemed to work just fine until it didn't. And today, yeah, it's obviously not the same story, but there are echoes of the same attempt to create a durable position for a different minority community with, of course, a different history and a different historical experience with the French Republic, vis-a-vis colonialism, etc. So, I mean, it's hard to compare, but there is that same sort of formulation going on, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So we will turn now to the questions, and Sarit will help us with some of the questions with the audience.
I want to jump in, and first of all, thank you also for a beautiful book and a great discussion so far. We've gotten a lot of questions, and so I want to ask you a little bit about the art, and then about the family's Judaism and Jewishness and Jewish practice, and then about the survivors. One question that came in was about the uniqueness of the French Jewish collections themselves. So wealthy Jewish Viennese collectors were interested in avant-garde art. Were the Jewish French collectors similarly interested?
So first of all, it's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. There are exceptions to every rule, of course, but on the whole, Jewish elites in this milieu in France in this moment were, if we can generalize about the community, were very much about the sort of 18th century high watermark of French culture. Now, Moïse de Quémondo's cousin, Isaac de Quémondo, had one of the great collections of Impressionism and sort of more modern items, which was donated to the Louvre in 1911, and the largest single acquisition the museum had received at the time. So I'm not saying it didn't happen, but on the whole, the tendency was this period because of what it signified. And I think, um, you know, there are a lot of parallels with Jewish collectors in other countries, vis-a-vis philanthropy and all of that. But, it's difficult to, I think, to match the way in which, I mean, this is still true. I mean, France is a country that is really obsessed with national identity in very peculiar and particular ways. And that was true even then. And so even the collecting in this rarefied world grappled with that, and indeed, entered that conversation about national identity, because of course the collections were means of expressing a national identity. So it wasn't just about what art pleased me the most, it was also about how I articulated my sense of belonging in this particular country with the art of the country properly and its own royal family and so on and so forth. And that belonging and art, I mean, again, I mentioned the Charles Delheim book, which is excellent and I highly recommend. Belonging takes many different directions and so on and so forth, but that is a sort of French peculiarity, I would say.
I have a question from my own curiosity about, were some of these families also antiquities collectors? Is that part of the story in any way? And if so, how?
Yes. So the Rothschilds in particular, specifically Edmond de Rothschild, who is not super present in my book, but is the subject of my next project, which is a short biography of him for the Jewish Lives series. He was a passionate archaeologist, and had a lot of those items as well. The Theodore Reinach, who is a character in the book, was a passionate Hellenist, and the villa that I write about of his is called the Villa Kerylos, which is a painstaking recreation of an ancient Greek villa at Delos in the south of France. Again, I always say, I feel like I got really, no one told me this before, but I just got really lucky in choosing a dissertation topic that brought me to such rough and tumble places, such as the Côte d'Azur. So choose your topics based on the archives. I think it's a good rule of thumb, but yeah, research in a place like that is not for the faint of heart, I will say, but it's a beautiful, it's a stunning place, and that was my favorite of all the villas. But yes, the presence of antiquity is important in the story, although I think a secondary interest for many of my characters compared to the 18th century stuff.
One of the questions that came in about those chateaus came in raising the question about Pierre Nerat's formulation about the lieu de mémoire. And it's, the scholar who is with us says it certainly seems that these chateaux and the objects they contain figure as lieu de mémoire, places of memory in Pierre Nerat's formulation. And yet, unless I missed it, the questioner says, nothing much about the Jewish contribution to France is accepted by Nerat, whose work has played an important role in the telling of France, what its history is. So, do you have any responses to that comment about those places?
To the comment to the part about how there's not much about the Jewish contribution in Noha, or there's
right. Well, these places are part of the.
Yeah. I think that's very much true. I think the lieu de mémoire concept is I don't know, it's so captivating, and I think it's very useful, but also kind of constricting in some ways. But on the whole, yeah, I would say that these places are, in the sense that well, they operate on different levels, which I find interesting about them. On the one hand, if you are a student of decorative arts, which I, by the way, am not. I'm not an art historian by training whatsoever, although I did learn quite a lot for doing the book, but I mean, no way. You will, these places are exquisite collections that tell us a lot about the cultural patrimony of one specific European nation. And that's really important in and of itself. I mean, they are amazing 18th century pieces, but they are amassed in the 19th century. So it also tells us, in the way that, the Victorians resuscitated the Gothic style, it tells us a lot about readings of history in different moments. But then they were amassed by Jewish families in a moment of crisis. And that is what interested me. But there are sort of multiple levels going on. And in that sense, each of them is sort of tangled together into this, this writing of history. So yes, I would say so.
I wanted to ask another question that came about the public practice of Judaism by these families and individuals, and about the climate of anti-Semitism in France at the time. So in what ways do they express their Judaism religiously and ritually, and how does that fit into the story?
What's really interesting, first of all, that's an excellent question. I'm glad that you ask it. What's interesting is that the families that I mentioned in the book, sort of each of them was the most, together they were sort of the heads of communal Judaism in France in the period. So France is a country that, from the legacy of Napoleon, there is a sort of central, what's called the consistoire, the central consistory, which is to this day exists and which kind of regulates and governs Jewish religious life in France. And each of these families was at one point on the board of the consistoire. Edmund de Rothschild was the president of it for a while. Theodor Reinach was the founder of the liberal Jewish called movement, but at the time, the liberal France is also a country of acronyms. I can never remember, but like basically the first major reform synagogue in France, he was one of the founders of, and that is the synagogue, or the original synagogue that I now belong to here in France. It still exists today. The Camondos, as Sephardic benefactors, were the founders of the big Sephardic synagogue in the Rue Buffo, which still exists today, or major donors to the synagogue as it opened up. So there was this sort of concerted and also huge funders of the Alliance Française coming as they did from Istanbul, from Constantinople, which is, the Alliance. Lisa Leff has written brilliantly on that. The sort of French Jewish cultural mission in colonies in the 19th century. Anyway, but they're all deeply involved in all of these sort of existent Jewish organizations. And what's interesting is there also is a lot of leaving the fold, to cite Todd Endelman, and that's mostly the women. And that's, I found very interesting. And I think, I quote in the book this fascinating diary that I found from one of Theodor Reinach's daughters, who never really converted, but who left Judaism because she found institutional organized Judaism to be an affront to women's rights and the place of women in public life. And you get the sense that for a lot of them, that was the case. Béatrice de Camondo, as I mentioned, became Catholic because of some sort of sense of belief, it seems, but her mother seems to have also become Catholic, not so much out of conviction, but just out of it was the sort of the alternative, the kind of main identity to be, if you were not going to be Jewish, or if you were going to, leave the fold. It wasn't sort of necessarily a religious embrace as it was a social thing. So, but it's complicated and it differed based on each case, but it's both the fact that they were the custodians of Jewish life in France, and also some of the first, in the case of many of the women, to leave the fold. And and both are true.
There's also a question that's related about Renoir's anti-Semitism, and if you could speak to that and how that fits in.
Yeah, there's so much on this, and I would say the best sort of short book that I know on this is Philip Nord has written on the sort of the painters during the Dreyfus Affair. There was a huge expo at the Jewish Museum in New York, and I think 89 or 90, about the affair and painters. And so it gets into the sort of the taxonomy of which famous painters that we know were anti-Semitic during the affair and which ones were pro-Dreyfus. But Renoir was decidedly anti-Dreyfus, and that was where a lot of this comes from. Because as Magda mentioned earlier, the Dreyfus affair was in many ways the first of these sort of ruptures that divided rooms, families, and the country. And in a way, the country is still divided along those Dreyfus fault lines, which is really amazing to observe. But so for Renoir, it's fascinating because he painted the portraits of many Jewish families and was invited to do so by Charles Ephrussi, who, as I mentioned, was a sort of Jewish collector and sort of cultural center of the powerhouse of the period. And so, Renoir thought that a lot of these Jewish patriots, it's the classic sort of anti-Semitic stereotype. He thought that they were exploitative and wealthy because of corrupt business practices and so on and so forth. But it's amazing because I think some of there's no trace of the anti-Semitism in the work that he did, and some of the paintings that he did of Jewish sitters are some of his most beautiful and most moving. And I would put Irene's portrait in that category. I think it's a stunning piece just as a work of art, and also of her sisters, Alice and Elizabeth. It's the two. I don't think I put that in the PowerPoint, but it's the two girls, one in blue, one in pink, and it's a charming and sort of very deep portrait. It's kind of like the best of Sargent, with the sort of interiority of these sort of elites in this moment of complicated prosperity, needless to say. But anyway, I don't find traces of anti-Semitism in the actual art, but it's absolutely there in the letters, and it's really interesting to think about how or what to make of that. And I sort of struggle with that in the book because, of course, it's part of the story. It's how the artist conceived of the sitter, but then many of the families, not the Caen d'Anvers, so to speak, but many of the other families adored the paintings that he made of them, and they became kind of priceless heirlooms.
And that's, of course, the opposite with Degas, whose paintings after the Dreyfus affair began to display some of the anti-Jewish.
Absolutely. There's that famous or infamous portrait of Ernest May, the banker, in the Bourse. Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think you can say the same with Renoir, at least in my opinion.
Oh, I'm glad you circled back to Irene, because many people listening are curious to know if she survived the war, and if so, how she survived. And then more generally, whether the survivors of these families, what they made of their pre-war lives, and did they have any insights that were helpful to you in understanding their stories?
Yes. So Irene does survive the war. I mean, I showed on the PowerPoint the picture of her in the late 50s. And it's just a bizarre story, honestly. And it's clear to me that there are pieces missing that I certainly wasn't able to find, and I'm not sure that we ever will, but I hope someone does. I know there is a book being written on Irene specifically in French, and I'm hoping that the author of that maybe will find more than I did. But anyway, what we know, I'll go through that briefly. So Irene marries this Catholic guy who works in the stables of her ex-husband named Carlo Sampieri. He's an Italian citizen, and then so when they get married, she gets Italian citizenship, and is able to live in Paris. It's amazing, but she managed to live in Paris and in the sort of immediate vicinity of the city all throughout the war. I want to say, I mean, what you often say is in hiding, but it's clear that she didn't hide that much, because there are kind of sightings of her and traces of her in places that you wouldn't go if you were trying not to be caught by the Germans. Now, another thing that I put in the book that is absolutely jarring is that in 1944, March 1944, when, by the way, Beatrice, Irene's daughter, and her grandchildren are already in Drancy, the kind of the so-called antechamber to Auschwitz, the concentration camp on the outskirts of Paris where the Nazis sent many French Jews before transferring them to Auschwitz, which, by the way, is on the way to Charles de Gaulle Airport. If you take the RERB from the center of the city, it's kind of jarring, but that's the case. So when Beatrice is already in Drancy, her aunt Elizabeth, who I showed you a picture of, the old woman who was infirm and who was captured, is also sent to Drancy, and that's Irene's sister. So Irene, we literally have a record of her going into the Ile de la Cité, which is not far from where I'm sitting now, and where one of the Gestapo headquarters was located. And she has a meeting with one of them, and she says, "You have to free my sister from Drancy because we're not Jewish." And we have the German record of the event, but nothing from her side. But it's clear that the officer doesn't believe her. But somehow he writes that he doesn't believe her, but he doesn't arrest her. And so why that would be the case, and why, if you were trying to hide, you would walk in to the literal nerve center of this whole empire of evil, is really confusing. And it suggests to me that there must have been somebody higher up protecting her. And I have a few theories about that. It seems that her daughter Poussy, I showed you the toddler, had married this guy André Dubonnet, who was the heir to the it's an alcohol fortune in France. And so he was quite to the far right politically and was in La Cagoule, this sort of thug organization during the war. And it seems likely that through his network, they may have been able to protect Iran. I mean, there's a lot of theories, but I wasn't able to prove any of them. But it's really bizarre. But we know that the meeting happened because there is a record of it. And obviously nothing happened with Elizabeth. But the other thing that's really, really striking is that she clearly tried to save her sister. But in that conversation, she had there was nothing in the minutes of that meeting that mentions anything about her trying to save her daughter or her grandchildren. So why would the one be true and not the other? I have no idea. We do know that Irene survives and does so with relative ease compared to what others went through. And after the war, she inherits Beatrice's fortune, which was, unbelievably massive, like huge, although slightly diminished because of the sort of the post-war economic crash, but still enormous. Gets all the money, and she and her daughter spend it. And that's all we know.
Thank you for answering that.
Thank you so much. This has been such a treat, intellectual treat. So thank you so much for joining us. I wish we could.
Thank you so much for having me. And I so appreciate you making the time.
Thank you. And please do read the book. It's really fantastic. It's now out in paperback. So, and join us for other events this semester. Thank you, James. Thank you, Sarit.
So much.
Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
Thank you again.